Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Running a little late on the chapter breakdown this week, but there's a ton to talk about, and I want to get right into it, so thank you for your patience, and let's do it. Things are really starting to pick up steam with our 22nd entry in the Ogre Child Yamato's Golden Harvest Surgard Pilgrimage cover story, as Yamato's gang comes upon a huge secret base hidden deep within the region of Udon. Now, before we get into the familiar face that sits atop, I should mention that it's not necessarily clear if Hold'em took the gang back to his hideout, or if they just came across this place independently. I think the former scenario is fairly likely, but we may just have to see how it goes in terms of Hold'em's involvement in all of this. Of course, the roof of the base is adorned with a replica of Who's Who's head in his full Zoan form, and Who's Who was part of the Animal Kingdom Pirates as one of the Tobiropo, or Flying Six, and we haven't seen him since his defeat to Jinbei back during the raid on Onigashima. Assuming that this means he's in charge of whatever operation is going on here, I'm looking forward to seeing the potential return of his subordinate crew known as Cats, as revealed in his V-Ray card. We saw these guys throughout Onigashima, hanging around Who's Who, as they were members of his former pirate crew before being absorbed under Kaido's flag. Also, their base, or domain within Onigashima, was known as the Big Cat Cafe, so I wonder if this is meant to be a new version of that. And thinking about it even more, Hold'em would make perfect sense under Who's Who's crew, given that he himself fits into the cat motif thanks to his lion smile. Going a bit further, we may also see other remnants of the Animal Kingdom pirates here as well. Perhaps this is where King was recovering in that vague panel that we saw of him during Vegapunk's broadcast. Lots of possibilities with this, so I'm excited to see where that goes. Now, obviously this building must be relatively new, unless Who's Who just had this base hidden deep in Udon unbeknownst to us all this time. This may help account for what happened to the foreman and expert carpenter Minatomo, as Who's Who's crew could have forced him to create this building for his operation. The other abductions, such as the soba shop workers, are a little harder to reconcile, but perhaps they're also being forced to work within the Big Cat Cafe. The one thing I'm not completely sure on, though, is that this group may not be behind the theft of Yasue's sword. After it was taken a few chapters ago, Yamato and the gang ran into Hold'em in Udon, and he seemingly attacked them and demanded their valuables. If he was the one who had the opportunity to steal the sword, he could have easily taken Yamato's bag and other items in that same instance. Plus, if his plan was to take the sword and run, it wouldn't make much sense to suddenly turn around and attack the crew for more. Also, if you look at this chapter, you'll notice that Yamato nor Hold'em have Yasue's sword on them, suggesting to me that someone else must have been the one to take the blade. We've suspected for a while now that not all of these abductions and thefts have to be connected to each other, and it's looking that may be the case. One last thing of note before moving on, bringing Who's Who back into the forefront of the story is quite interesting, as after all, he was the one who introduced the very concept of Nika the Sun God into the story. Given all the lore surrounding the Sun God we've been getting in Elbaph, I wonder if we'll get some complementary developments in the cover story. Perhaps Who's Who ended up as a devout follower of Nika after Luffy assumed his form and defeated Kaido. Whatever it is, I can't wait for the next entry in this cover story, but with all of that said, let's get into chapter 1136, The Land That Awaits the Sun. We pick things up where we left off in the last one, with Chief Jarl entering the scene. Luffy mentions how the moose meat tastes like dinosaur, and that's largely because it is. The Giants have been referring to the Wintersaurus, a design taken from the film Strong World, as a moose, and you'll recall Luffy had the pleasure of eating dinosaur all the way back during Little Garden. Colin can be seen running around, evoking the Nika pose, as Jarl explains that humans do not often make it to the Sun World, and instead think that the Underworld is all Elbaph has to offer. This could further reinforce Louis Arnaud's message from earlier in the arc about the dangers lurking in Elbaph. Meanwhile, the rest of the Straw Hats mingle with the Giants, and Usopp boasts about his adventures. We learn that the Elbaph Giants have spoken of Oars throughout their history, and are amazed that Usopp was able to defeat him. Of course, we know that it was mostly a team effort from the Straw Hats, with the finishing blow being dealt by Luffy. Sanji and Jinbei tell the Giants about fishmen and mermaids, as Sanji reminisces on the Mermaid Cove on Fishman Island. The Giants also marvel at Brook's existential quandary, as Zoro and Nami reflect on how surprising it is that these Giants have never left Elbaph, further reinforcing the isolationist nature of this nation. Rodo attempts to apologize to the Straw Hats for his prior actions, as they all tease him for his stupidity. One of the Giants even questions if Rodo even knew about how high their bounties were, which does make you wonder for a bit which bounties in particular are being referred to here. Many fans have been hoping for a bounty update after the events of Egghead, but when the other half of the crew reviewed the newspaper before arriving on the island, we were only shown the new bounties for Dory and Brogy. While it is possible the Straw Hats received bounty increases, I don't know how relevant that'll be, considering how remarkable the post-Wano bounty increases were across the crew. If anything, I would think that those were the ones being referred to here. Roto explains that his actions earlier were actually him trying to carry out the shared dream of all Elbaph giants, the desire to become the sun god and rule over the world. This brings up an interesting discussion as we learn that there are many different interpretations of who the sun god was, even within Elbaph itself. Some believe him to be a deity of destruction, others liberation, some a ruler, and some a god of laughter. All of these different interpretations seem to be coming from a set of religious texts that have been passed down through the generations, referred to as the Harley. Jarl explains that they are unable to translate it in full, leading to all of this confusion. It's not clear what language the text is in. Presumably it would not be the same language found on the poneglyphs, as Vegapunk may have been able to decipher it if that were the case, as he did with the few other poneglyphs that he studied, but who knows, maybe Robin will be able to have a better chance at it. Now interestingly, the Harley mentions how the world has been destroyed twice in the past, and that each time the sun god was involved, but to what end is not exactly clear. Some think he's responsible for the destruction, while others think he's the savior, and in either case, Nika is always present with great change, which explains why the 5 elders in the world government have been so afraid of the Fruit's awakening. The world being destroyed twice before would suggest that there were 2 prior instances of Nika's appearance. One of those may likely have been with Joy Boy during the Void Century, but the other instance is not clear. Could that have maybe been Nika's original incarnation, before that ability somehow became a devil fruit? It's also interesting to note that the world of One Piece has 2 known calendar systems, with the Age of the Heavens being mentioned by Robin while reading the Alabasta Poneglyph, and the Age of the Sea Circle having been referenced in Nolan's logbook back during the Jaya arc. For a long time, these mentions of calendar systems have just been taken as mere flavor text or irrelevant historical lore, but maybe they actually were the calendar systems used after each time the world was restored. Of course, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about how this is not the first time this sort of destructive prophecy was mentioned, as Charlie spoke of Luffy being the one to destroy Fishman Island. Perhaps that was just a microcosm of what is being mentioned in this chapter. Also, while the destruction and rebirth of the world is very reminiscent of Ragnarok and Norse mythology, it could also be interpreted as something more figurative than literal, instead evoking a change in how people live and govern themselves. Now, the depiction of Nika that we get here is pretty interesting, as we had seen him depicted in silhouette before with a spear and a sword, but here he's shown with a shield, and on it is a familiar sun pattern that we've seen across the series in various cultures. The one most explicitly that resembles this was a shield that we saw in Skypiea. The way he's shown gripping the sword is also a bit reminiscent of Luffy holding the Nidai Katetsu improperly while fighting on Wano. Jarl also mentions the understanding of Nika's appearance as having white clothing and white clouds. This was also hinted at by Dory and Brogy during the Egg Hut arc, as they said Luffy looked like one of their gods. Back then, I also mentioned how this is in pretty stark contrast to the Buccaneers' understanding of Nika, as they did not know what he looked like, but had a better understanding of his ability to stretch. This all goes to show that across cultures, the sun god is interpreted differently. Before, I had figured that Loki's belief in him being the sun god must have been informed by the devil fruit that he ate, since he felt so confident in him being that figure. However, now with this new information that all of the giants aspire to be like the sun god, I can see a potential future where the devil fruit does not necessarily resemble Luffy's in any form, which makes things a bit more exciting. Jarl actually mentions how both Loki and Harold were trying to become Nika as well, which led them to their eventual fates. As Luffy wonders if Loki's a good person, the giants try to set the story straight. From this, we learn that even before Loki was born, Harold had foreseen that Loki would bring about his demise, and from there misfortune only piled on as the royal steed was killed and Chief Yorl died by the hands of Big Mom in the same year, followed by the queen's death in the following one. Within a decade, Loki had befriended the wild beasts of the underworld, as we had learned in earlier chapters in this arc, and throughout his maturation he caused plentiful destruction to the land, eventually leading up to the death of King Harold. It's at this point we get our first look at the late king, albeit silhouetted. It's not entirely clear what we're supposed to be looking at, but given the various cracks running through the image and frame, it seems to be a portrait of sorts. We learn that Jarl was there when Loki killed Harold, and that was when he was stabbed through the head. Eventually, it seems like Loki left for the sea and was brought in by Shanks around 6 years prior, which we had discussed in a different video. That was the same year that Shanks became recognized as an emperor. Now, Loki having left for sea at some point is rather interesting, as it allows for 2 questions to start getting answers. Firstly, this could have been around the time that Loki first encountered Lola and expressed interest in her. This explains how he would be the surprised suitor that popped in on Lola, despite him having been an Elbaph his whole life up until then. Of note, all the information we've learned so far also helps reconcile why the giants would have suddenly been alright with this marriage arrangement with Big Mom, as it always seemed odd to me that they suddenly would marry off their beloved prince to their worst enemy. Perhaps the Elbaph giants were alright with this because it would mean that Loki would no longer be their problem, and perhaps from King Harold's perspective, this was an attempt at forging peace and resolving a long-standing grudge. Also, Loki's travels could help reconcile how Loki ended up with a special bounty if he had become known as a pirate, and I'll get into this more later, but this may even allow Loki to become a candidate for the pirate that the alleged fake Shanks wanted to discuss with the Five Elders during the reverie. Now, it's at this point that I should also bring up the possibility that a lot of what is being told to Luffy here may not be the whole truth. There's been a few reasons to think that Loki is not all that bad or as bad as he's being made out to be, given Luffy's inherent interest in him and Shaggy's words from the previous chapters. I'm sure he's been a menace his entire life, but it could be that his motivations are simply being misunderstood. Some have even wondered if he was being framed for his father's murder. One thing to note, Jarl is said to have received his injury while being present for Loki's attack on Harold, but the strange thing about it is the sword stuck in Jarl's head is nearly identical to the sword that we see in Harold's portrait. Why would Harold's blade have struck Jarl? It could have been something as simple as Loki taking his father's blade against the Elder, but in the case that Harold was attacking Jarl, there could be something more interesting at play. After all, Jarl was shown to have been against the policies like trade over plunder back when Cartmel was president, so it follows that he may have also opposed Harold's ideals. It's also interesting that while the entire village laments Harold and disdains Loki, Jarl is the only one to so calmly shift their fates off to the pursuit of being Nika. Across this chapter, his expression remains consistent, except for when Luffy mentions that everyone thinks he looks like Nika, and I'm not sure exactly what to make of it, but it is a bit suspicious, especially when you consider that the people of Elbaph did not always express a disdain for Loki, as he was celebrated after his birth back during Big Mom's flashback, despite the giants in present day acting like he was always evil. Now, throughout the sequence of Loki's backstory, we get more silhouettes of the prince in various sizes. This all contributes to the idea that this account of Loki may not necessarily be absolute, and instead is just one interpretation or understanding of these events, similar to how Loki was portrayed to be so different during Whole Cake Island. Of note, Loki is also shown assuming a laughing pose quite similar to how Luffy does in Gear 5th, reinforcing this idea that Loki may believe himself to be the sun god. Now, just for the timeline's sake, if we take into account what was said earlier in the arc about how Loki tried to escape his punishment, and it took all of Elbaph's warriors to stop him, I would think that the incident occurred after Shanks brought him back. A bit later on, Zoro and Nami pick up on Luffy acting strangely, and they thankfully get to the bottom of it and learn of Loki's request. While Zoro doesn't entirely trust him based on his reputation, he is willing to tag along for Luffy's sake, and it's stuff like this that further pushes this idea that we're only being told one version of the events, with how untrustworthy or bad Loki is being repeatedly brought up. I also like that we're getting a side journey with the 3 original Straw Hats, further evoking that classic One Piece feel that we had with the first 6 crewmates back in the LEGO world. Though of course, coming along with them is Roto, who has now become Nami's 3rd servant, as he's informed by Zeus. Sanji had previously argued with the Cloud over this title. I do enjoy a lot of the gags across these few pages, especially the classic one with Nami's eyes turning into berry symbols. It's been a while since we've had that, and it's also pretty fitting that Nami is tagging along to help steal the key to Loki's chains, allowing her to make use of that skill set. Meanwhile, in the underworld, the cloaked figures from the last few chapters have already made their way down to Loki, and it seems we're getting hard confirmation that they are indeed holy knights. But interestingly, they're here to recruit Loki into their ranks. There's a lot to unpack with this, so let's start with the aforementioned idea of Loki being the pirate that the cloaked Shanks figure had wanted to discuss with the elders. Could it be that they wanted to recruit Loki as far back as during the reverie? If that's the case, why would they have held off so long? What changed? Well, perhaps the elders, and more specifically Saturn, who would be the head of science and defense, had declined this request. But with Garling having replaced Saturn in that role a few days ago, he may have had the authority to allow this request to go through. And maybe the decision was not solely reliant on the godhead of science and defense. Maybe the rest of the elders declined as well, but we're seeing Garling make use of his status to allow it anyways. Who knows? But the other interesting component to this is the idea that the Holy Knights may not all be celestial dragons. So far, we had just assumed this to be the case, and even Loki wonders similarly in this chapter, but it hasn't yet been said outright. At this moment, the only Holy Knight confirmed to be a celestial dragon is Garling, as evidenced by his introduction having Saint as a title. And in this chapter, we have our second named Holy Knight, who is lacking any title or family name whatsoever, named Gunko. It could be that Oda is slow rolling that reveal here, but unless her family name is incredibly important, I don't know what the benefit of that would be. Also, we've gotten other celestial dragons referred to with their title and first name, such as Saint Charlos, so if she were a world noble, then I feel like it would be included here. What's more is that in Japanese, her name Gunko is composed of the kanji that reads military child or girl. This of course fits in with her aesthetic, but I wonder if it's possible that her name was given to her because of her potential status as a child born into the military. It could be that she's not a proper celestial dragon and instead was just raised to be a soldier, though she does speak a lot like them. Her design is also reminiscent of Koala from the Revolutionary Army, with a similar hat, glasses, and hair, though she does seem to have a bit of heterochromia going on with 2 different colored eyes. With all of the speculation surrounding Shanks having a clone or twin, I wonder if Oda would really do that again with Gunko and Koala. But who knows, maybe all of the Holy Knights are related to someone we already know. That could be fun. Now, as for her abilities, we saw her make use of some sort of bandage-related power in the last chapter to subdue the giants, but now we see that these bandages or cloths are actually taken from her own clothing, and in this chapter, making use of her extended sleeves. I know there's been some discourse about her distinct lack of pants, but I have to wonder if this was the byproduct of using so many wraps against the giants in that last chapter. People have also made the connection of this ability taking shape as an arrow and the arrow-like shadow that we saw used against Sabo and Cobra by Emu, and while there are some differences, namely in the size of the shape of the arrowhead, there is some world where this power was granted to her by Emu. When the cloaked Shanks-like figure asks about intel, Gunko explains that their last transmission received by agents was about a giant bird appearing before them. This is more than likely in reference to Mugen, Roto's raven, that had been abducting people from the coast of the island. It's hard to say if everyone in that Lego village was a government agent, but in either case, it seems Roto has been unintentionally protecting his nation. While Loki refuses to stoop to the level of the celestial dragons and work for them, Gunko decides to force his hand by suffocating his dear friend, the wolf. But interestingly, this doesn't work, as Loki expresses that a true warrior does not fear his death, nor does he fear how he dies, which is a bit different from what we saw with the Elbaph giants wanting to have an honorable death, as much as possible. Of note, it doesn't seem like Loki recognizes this cloaked figure as Shanks or someone who looks similar, probably because the angle at which he's shown doesn't allow him to get a clear look at his face through the cloak's hood. Now, this arc is sure getting interesting, and there's a lot of directions it could go, with a bunch of mysteries still unsolved. Will Loki get freed? Will the Straw Hats intervene? Will they be blamed? What of the silhouetted man on the island? When does he come into play? And what of Colin's father? So much to come in the next several chapters, and I can't wait to get into it. There's no break next week, so I'll be here for that. Let me know what you thought of this chapter in the comments below, and as always, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.